For a few years now, I've been interested in this idea of divination. Some of you may have heard of that word or have some sense of what that means. Some of you may think that that's completely stupid and ridiculous, any forms of divination. That's okay if you do. So divination, it's an ancient practice that's found in pretty much every ancient culture of various sorts, ancient China. Apparently that's where Chinese characters ultimately come from, is a form of divination on oracle bones. And these days, we think about tarot, or we think about runes maybe, or the I Ching from ancient China as well. Ancient India had divination, ancient Greece, all over the world. And put simply, divination is usually posing a question and getting some sort of response through some sort of medium, like the oracle bones or tarot cards or whatever. So you're using some sort of physical medium that is giving you a response to an inquiry or a question or an issue that you want insight on or clarification on. And for me, it's really just kind of fascinating, and it's a creative practice because I'm somewhat agnostic about if there's ever any supernatural thing going on. At the very least, it's just kind of psychological, and it's a way for me it forces me to use my creative mind to make sense of whatever that response is, to try to gain clarity about something in my life, So I love tarot cards, and I love other forms of divination. One of the forms of divination that I do sometimes with friends and with Valeria is book divination, what I call book divination, which is basically just asking a book a question and then closing your eyes and then opening the book to a random page, and then with your eyes closed, pointing to a spot on that page, and then opening your eyes, and whatever you pointed to is kind of the response to your question, and it's book divination. Super fun, and it's yielded really interesting results, honestly. And so a couple months ago, I was doing book divination with Valeria, and I asked a Wallace Stevens book called The Necessary Angel, Essays on Reality and Imagination. Wallace Stevens is a poet, but he's got this one collection of prose essays. So I asked that book, what is the healthiest way to navigate the past and the present? That's the random question I came up with. And I turned the page, turned to a random page, pointed to a little passage, and I don't remember what the passage said verbatim, but I do remember that it had the word analogy and allegory in the passage, and my creative interpretation of what it was saying, because basically at the very least I pretend as if it's saying something significant, and just why not? So I'm like, okay, what is this saying? And my creative interpretation was basically, there are two primary modes to navigate the past. I know this sounds kind of weird, but just go with me. Two primary modes to navigate the past and the present. One mode is through analogy, and one mode is through allegory. And I was like, well, that's fascinating. And at the time, it seemed to be saying that allegory might be a more meaningful or often healthier way to navigate the past and the present versus analogy. So ever since then, I've been, reflecting on it, journaling about it, having conversations about it, just trying to make sense of what that might mean. And so I've done a lot of thinking about it, and I want to start this part of the talk by giving some simple definitions of each of those words. There's multiple definitions that you can find in a dictionary for each of those words, but the one that I chose to work with for analogy is a comparison between two things, typically for the purpose of explanation or clarification. And then the definition for allegory that I chose to work with is a story, poem, or picture that can be interpreted to reveal a hidden meaning. And so I want to say that after reflecting on this and kind of trying to make sense of it since the book divination, I've kind of realized that there's a light and shadow side to seeing the past as an analogy, and there's a light and a shadow side to seeing it as an allegory, if that makes sense. So I'll talk more about that in a second. Basically, there's strengths and weaknesses to both approaches, you know. So perhaps some of the light sides or some of the positive sides of seeing the past as analogy or seeing memories as analogies is that it kind of just gives a fundamental base of sanity and familiarity by seeing the resemblance between things and having reference points and just, like being able to see the similarities and compare things, compare memories, and having a sense of familiarity and sanity, I would say. Those are some of the light sides of seeing the past as analogy. Some of the shadow sides of that approach is that if every day is just an analogy for another day, then sometimes it's like every day is just a copy of a copy of a copy, and days are just disposable and replaceable, and it can feel disenchanted because it's like, well, this day was so similar to this day that, like, where's the novelty, basically? Where's the uniqueness? And I think that sometimes we feel that way. I mean, it's easy to feel that way when I think our work schedules, our daily routines, all that kind of stuff can feel deadening sometimes, and the shadow side of analogy. So seeing the past as allegory, or seeing memories as allegories, and I've mainly been thinking about it like personal memories, you know, an individual's relationship with their own past and their own memories for the most part. So seeing the past as allegory, or memories as allegories, related to our first session up there, I think that, like, all of us kind of have a greatest hits or a highlight reel of memories. Not to say the positive ones, but the most emotionally charged or meaningful memories that play back in our head more than other memories, you know? So I think all of us kind of have our own version of that. And so I would think that those emotionally charged memories, the ones that we play back more than others, are like prime material for looking at them, investigating them, looking at them as allegories if we want to, right? And if we're looking at a memory as an allegory and looking for the hidden meaning, to me that's kind of like, it's not some super mysterious thing, it's more like a psychological shadow work or something, where you're looking at a memory that's emotionally charged and formative, like a memory that we were talking about earlier, and we're saying, you can ask yourself, what's the hidden meaning, or AKA, what does this suggest? What does it express? What does it highlight? What does it reveal about the forces and the factors that shape who I am, basically, and also about maybe blind spots or strengths and weaknesses that we might have, or obstacles or possibilities, or any of that sort of stuff. So I think that can be really useful to us. And so I would say that the light side of doing that, of kind of looking at our own memories and looking for the meaning of them, you know, looking at what they might suggest about what we can learn from them in order to better understand ourselves, or to better understand how we can grow, you know, because that's something that has come up in conversations that I've had with Valeria about this, is that's an important factor. It's like we're extracting meaning in order to help us grow, not to extract the meaning by itself, but in the context of like, okay, how does this help me better understand myself, and how can it maybe foster my growth, you know? So I would say that that's the light side, is that the positive side of doing something like that is that it can help us better understand ourselves and help us grow. I would say that some of the shadow sides of doing that is that we can start to overanalyze ourselves, and if we're looking at the past and constantly like, what does that mean? What does that suggest? You know, and you're just investigating and picking apart constantly, it can put you in an obsessive loop, and that whole paralysis by analysis thing, and you're just like, you can get too in your head and you can get stuck. So obviously there's a shadow side. And I also want to mention that, like, you know, obviously certain super traumatic memories might not be wise or healthy to dive right into those, you know. So it's like we have to be discerning and careful with everything in our lives, including this practice. So, with one kind of side thing I want to mention is with the whole shadow work idea, because, Carl Jung, I think, is the first person who, popularized this notion of shadow work, and really the way I think about it is, looking at the things that we usually are either too scared to look at or that we've been unconscious about on one level or another, whether we're not even aware of not looking at it, or it's like having the motivation to start looking under the hood a little bit, I guess. And I think about that as like a form of, I've been thinking about this notion of consecration. Consecration means to make something sacred, And for some reason I've been, as Mike knows and Tyler, we've talked about making something sacred. What does that mean, And I've been thinking about that, and I'm still working through that. But to consecrate our own past, to make our own past sacred, one way I've thought about it is that you're seeing it as worthy of attention. You're seeing your past and your memories as worthy of attention. But again, not just worthy of attention, but worthy of attention in the context of your own growth, I think. Because otherwise it can be obsessive and you can lose yourself, So those are some of the basic ideas. I know it's a strange topic, kind of. But I like to do these book divinations, and even if I get some wacky response, again, I'm like, I just kind of, you take it and run with it and try to just creatively interpret it in a way that might, give me some meaning in some way. So I just want to close by saying that in my own life right now, so exactly 10 years ago, I was living in San Francisco, and I was moving, exactly 10 years ago, I was moving from San Francisco back to Georgia, where I'm originally from. So the last month I lived in San Francisco, I gave a lot of poetry readings, because at the time I was writing a lot of poetry, and I was going to these poetry readings, and sometimes I'd be invited to read poems, and I got lucky that last month. It was really interesting. All of a sudden, I had more readings than I had ever had in the 3 years that I lived in San Francisco. So it was like this cluster of readings, and it felt sacred, it felt special, it was cool. And then now, 10 years later, I'm about to move from LA, and I have this cluster of talks that I'm giving, because I gave a talk at the church for a Sunday service, like recently. I gave a talk at the salon. I'm giving this talk, and then Valeria and I are giving a talk on Saturday. And so it's just like, there's an analogy between those things, right? There's a resemblance between those two moments of my life. There's a comparison, there's a parallel. So there's an analogy, but it feels like where analogy and allegory collide, because it seems also like an allegory. And we could think about that in a lot of ways, but the one simple way I've been considering it is okay, there's definitely a similarity going on here between those two moments, but there's a difference, because then I was reading poems, and now I'm giving these weird talks. And so it makes me basically I think one useful way to do practices like this for me is to have living questions. Rainer Maria Rilke has a famous passage about live the question, live in the question. And I really like that. And so whenever I do tarot divination with people, I often just try to leave people with questions to just wrestle with, And so the questions I'm trying to wrestle with when I'm thinking about the collision between analogy and allegory with what's going on right now versus 10 years ago in San Francisco is what does this express / suggest about who I've become, the transformations I've gone through, the shifts I've gone through from then until now. I have two little 3-part models that I think about. What to discard, what to transform, and what to preserve from the past. What should we discard, what should we transform, and what should we preserve? So I'm thinking about that for myself in general, as I'm going through this new chapter, going into this new chapter. And another 3-part thing is, What am I moving from? What am I moving through? And what am I moving to? So those are some of the living questions I am living with right now. And perhaps you can use the same ones for yourself. You can explore, even just as an experiment to see what happens, trying to consider what it might mean to navigate your own past and your own memories through the lens of an analogy or an allegory and see what happens. And hopefully, one or more of these ideas resonated with you. And I appreciate you being here. I appreciate you listening. That's it.